All right, well, we still have people drifting in, but I'm going to continue to admit them, and I'm just going to get started because we have so much we can cover today. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Advocacy 201, The Strategies. This webinar is the second one in a three-part series to help you get equipped essentially to engage and educate your elected officials. So, in today's webinar, you'll be hearing from a panel of three experienced policy advocates on their best tips and tricks and examples of work. So today's webinar is being recorded, as you probably heard, and also the slides, as well as that recording, will be shared with everyone who registered. So before we jump in, I do want to give an opportunity for folks to introduce themselves in the chat so we can see who all is on today's call. So when introducing yourself, please say your name and your organization. And for example, my name is Hale Crumley, and I'm the policy manager at Prosperity Indiana. So please go ahead now and introduce yourself in the chat. And while you are doing that, I want to briefly introduce the organization hosting today's event. Prosperity Indiana is Indiana's Association for Community Economic Development. We have approximately 200 members across the state of Indiana, and they span pretty much every sector, as you can see here, with a big concentration in the nonprofit area. If you'd like to join our network and find out all the different ways that you can reap the benefits with us, please do reach out. We also have our web page on our website that has a bunch of information for you. Okay, and with that, I now want to give our panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves to you. So each of these partners are highly experienced with engaging legislators, and they're also close partners of Prosperity Indiana. And so I'm just going to go down the line here that you can see on your screen. So first up in introductions is Emily, and then we will move on to Steve. Emily?
Hey, my name is Emily Weichert Bryant. I am the executive director of Feeding Indiana's Hungry, which is the state association of Feeding America affiliate food banks. Shout out to my food bankers on the call. I've seen a few of you. Um, our job is to advocate on behalf of the food banks, the pantries that they work with, and the neighbors that they serve. And so we've been in this space for almost 20 years. Um, my background is that I came from being on legislative staff. I spent about 7 years on staff doing policy and legal in the Senate, and came into this job looking to expand our advocacy space. And so we work on both state and federal issues looking more like at the Farm Bill or child nutrition reauthorization, or I'm a nerd. I have C-SPAN on in the background, watching for the National Defense Authorization Act today because there's a piece in there, things like that, as well as at the state level, looking at funding that supports food banks, policy around federal nutrition programs that are state administered, running interference on anything that would negatively impact those programs, the food banks that are part of our membership, and the clients that they serve.
Great, thank you. Steve?
Hello, everybody. I'm Steve Huffman. I'm the president and CEO of Brightpoint. We are a nonprofit organization in the northeast corner of the state, centered around Fort Wayne. We serve 14 counties. We're a community action agency, a CDFI, so forth. We basically are working to fight poverty and provide a broad range of services in that realm, from early education to youth services to financial assistance, housing development, lending, and so forth. I started getting into advocacy most prominently about 12 years ago. I've been at Brightpoint for almost 25 and CEO for 14 or so. And about 2 years into that, just really saw the need. I saw us helping people every day, one family at a time, and then some piece of legislation or a policy decision wreck the whole thing and impact hundreds or thousands of our people. So it really, to me, became obvious that if I wanted us to impact our mission, I needed to get involved in that space. And so I was quite the novice to start with, nervous to start with, and over the years I've gotten a little bit better at it. So I'm thankful to be here and honored to be here to talk to you all.
Thanks, Steve. I'm glad to have you too. Jen, we'll wrap up with you.
Thank you. I'm the CEO of a for-purpose organization that has a few different buckets of work focused on older adults and those that have experienced financial hardships. So we definitely work with people who are defined as being in poverty based on a certain percentage of income, and those that are just struggling financially, and we're trying to avoid and prevent them from sliding into poverty. But we're also a designated area agency on aging. We're a designated community action similar to Steve. We have the same designation, but we all work towards our community needs. So Steve's in a Fort Wayne area, and I'm in the Northwest Indiana section. So I've got those counties in that top part of the state. We also do the WIC program. So a lot of people, I was looking in the chat, probably are aware of the Women, Infant, and Children program. And then one of the bigger pieces that we are really focused on and newer due to a merger we just underwent is being a designated community housing development organization. And we just had a ribbon cutting just the other day for a new tax credit low income property that people are moving into today. And so all of that requires some of that legislative advocacy. So as Steve mentioned, in this role, it becomes a requirement if you need support and change and you're trying to fulfill your mission. So for me, I dabbled in legislative connections for probably about 7 years, but it's the last three where I've had to lead and ignite some of those connections. So I appreciate being a part of this and kind of sharing my experience and thoughts around the topic, Hale. And I'll just say, as you said, this is a 201. I think I belong in the 201, just given my journey. I'm not a 301 yet, but happy to share what I'm learning if that inspires some other people today. So thank you.
That is awesome. I appreciate it. Thank you all. I'm so glad to have all three of you here today to share your expertise at whatever levels they are and whatever corners of the state that they are. And you also have different subject matter expertise too. So I think we have a really good group here. So as you probably inferred, today we are here to discuss the best ways to essentially advocate for the issues that you care about. That's really what this whole series revolves around. And again, it's a 3-part series. This is just the second part. In order to do so, though, to talk about advocacy, I want to briefly remind folks that the term advocacy, even though I'm going to continue using it, really does mean the combination of education and lobbying. So some people do both, whereas others prefer to only educate elected officials. But really, no matter what combination that you plan to use, the information in today's webinar will be helpful to you. And if you want to learn more about the difference between educating and lobbying, please visit Prosperity Indiana's YouTube channel, where you can rewatch our recording of Advocacy 101, The Rules. And that was the first webinar in this 3-part series. So we brought a lawyer in to talk about that, and I think it could be really helpful. But again, today we're talking about strategies. And in this entire series, I want to note we are not talking about electioneering, but that definition is here on the screen for you to see. And if you'd like to learn more about that, I recommend looking up Boulder Advocacy. They've got some helpful information. So today we're going to be, again, approaching this conversation about strategies. And the way that we're going to do it is we are going to offer a mini lesson on each strategy that we're highlighting today. There will be 3 of them. And then after we do our mini lesson, we will then turn to our expert panelists to ask some questions and get their input. So at the very end, we are probably going to have time for questions from the audience. And if you have any, please drop them in the chat throughout the webinar so that we can look at those at the end. So with that, I'm now going to turn things over to my colleague Andrew to give an overview of which strategies we're discussing today, and then he will dive into the first mini lesson. Andrew?
Thanks so much, Hale. It's good to be here. I'm Andrew Bradley, Senior Director of Policy and Strategy for Prosperity Indiana. And first of all, thanks to Hale for putting together this series and assembling really great guests and strong partners of PI. So thank you, Emily and Jen and Steve, for your expertise that you'll be sharing. So I'm here to walk you through some of our top strategies that Prosperity Indiana uses and how we want to raise the voice of our partners in advocacy. Before we dive into these, though, I want to start with a bit of the why. Why are we advocating? Hale gave you a definition of what advocacy is, but even before we talk about the strategies, knowing the why is really important for each individual. And as our experts will talk about, the why may come from the work that you do. The why may come from you are working on the ground with programs and you running into barriers and you want to improve the way that those programs work. You might also find that while you're able to help individuals, that if policies were structured differently, we could help a larger number of people or may be able to reach folks that we couldn't reach otherwise. So often advocacy gets to that policy need of being able to break systemic barriers to be able to strengthen our communities and improve people's lives. And I think that that is a common thread of all of Prosperity Indiana's members, is that we want to improve lives for Hoosiers and increase economic opportunity so that we have strong communities. Let's dive into those three strategies. You see them here in front of you. And for each of these, as we go on through this webinar, I'll give you a little bit of the background about why each of these are important, and then start the conversation about how each of these work and the type of recommendations and proven methods that we use. And then our panel will talk through how they do those things in real life. So here in front of you, you see them. Developing ongoing relationships with legislators, sharing strong stories, and then identifying and utilizing the most effective angle. Let's dive into the very first one of those, developing ongoing relationships with legislators. And I want to emphasize this is probably the best foundation. If I could give you one recommendation from today, it would be to make sure and to start the process that you are getting to know who your legislators are, developing those relationships, and then carrying those forward for all the other advice that we have for you today. And here's a few reasons why this is so important. So legislators are real people. They're humans. They often have places where they're experts. They may have come through business. They may have come from other backgrounds that made them valuable in the electoral process. But that doesn't mean that they're experts in everything. And we want to make sure that our partners know that they are the experts when it comes to the work that they do and the communities that they serve, and frankly, the problems that they encounter in ways that legislators may not know. So lawmakers need that information about what's happening in their districts so that they can make good, informed decisions. And we need to approach each of these relationships knowing that they want to do the right thing, but sometimes they need help and they need the right information. Those relationships also create two-way accountability. If lawmakers don't have the right information, it's hard to hold them accountable for making the right decisions. And so that's one way that accountability goes. But another way that accountability goes is making sure that we as citizens and as stakeholders in our communities are providing the right type of information and what legislators need to make those good decisions. So finally, what I have on this slide is just a heads up that this all takes time, but don't let that deter you from making the first step. While we want to prepare you with the tools you need to get started on this process, it can be, years to perfect the process of getting to know those legislators, and building up that credibility does take time, but it's worth it. And in the long term, having a relationship is going to be more productive than being temporarily loud on an issue. Let's go to the next slide then and jump into what are some ways to do this. So first of all, it's really important to know which policymakers and agencies serve your entire service area at the federal, state, and local levels. We'll be talking a lot about it, the state level here today, but it's important to know across all those branches. The first step is to make sure that you're thinking about the legislators that cover your full service area, not just the address where your office is located. And we'll give you a tool for that here in a minute. Another tip to keep in mind is that it's really important to start that relationship whenever possible before a crisis hits, before you need something tomorrow. And in fact, if you could, even today and this week, reach out to those legislators and start that process, so much the better. If you know some from other ways of working in your community, starting to provide those opportunities to get to know them, that's going to build the foundation so that you're not in a place where you're frantically trying to get a message across in an emergency. And then another thing to just really keep in mind is, again, legislators are human. There's not all good and not all bad. Almost always, legislators have done something that is praiseworthy. And so it's really important to make sure that you're thanking them and recognizing them for good work, for something that they've done positive for your community. And then you can build in the conversation about areas that need improvement. And sometimes establishing that common ground, that's what can get a conversation off on the right start. All right, and so on the next slide, here's one specific tool. And again, you'll get this in a slide, but this is the best way to know who is actually representing your service area. This tool on the state's website has an embedded Google map. The name of the page is Find Your Legislator. If you just Google Find Your Legislator Indiana, that should be the top result. And on that Google map, it'll go down to the street level. So literally you can find out where those boundaries are. And if, for example, you serve a multi-county area, you want to be thinking about who are all the different legislators that cover that. And you want to start building a relationship with them all. Now, here at Prosperity Indiana, we can help in terms of knowing who are the legislators that are on committees that are important or that cover certain areas or what their areas of expertise are. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but it really is a responsibility of all of us to know who those folks are and to think about how you're going to develop those relationships. One other tool that's here on this page, we're talking a lot about the state, but the second link here, that will show you all of your elected officials from the federal all the way down to the local level, and that's super helpful as well. And same principles go. You want to be thinking about who's representing your entire service district. So Hale, back to you.
Thank you, Andrew. So actually, we're now going to go back to our panel for their first round of questions. Very exciting. And my first question is for Emily. So Emily, your work in the food security space means that you are often working with some of the same committees and thus the same legislators every year. So how does interacting with their staff play into keeping up these positive ongoing relationships?
Thanks. That's a fantastic question. And it's always fun for me to talk about this coming from a staff perspective, because there are a lot of people that I work with in the lobby now who I knew when they were lobbying the members that I worked for. So I always tell folks that advocacy is just like development work. You're developing those relationships. It's a different donor relationship, and that maybe they're getting you a state contract, or maybe it's a program specific change, or maybe it's direct funding, but you're talking to legislators and to folks in that setting because you want something from them, right? So just like talking to legislators, staff fall into that category. Our Indiana General Assembly has a small staff. Oftentimes, one staff person will be a legislative assistant for 2 or 3, or depending on the time of year, sometimes 4 members. There's kind of a flux. Folks leave after session, folks are being hired. But that gives that staff an incredible amount of access because they are those gatekeepers. So a legislator, you may be able to grab in the hallway if you're in the state house, but if you're calling or emailing, 95% of the time, that point of contact is going to a staff person. They're typically young. They're typically interested in the process and interested in making a difference. And so they come at it from a perspective of wanting to be helpful. The other thing to remember too is that today's staffer can be tomorrow's legislator. There's 2 or 3 state legislators right now who were a legislative assistant at one point. It's not an uncommon glide path for folks. And so it puts them in a significant space to learn, to absorb. They can be an advocate for that issue along with you. So getting to know the staff is a worthwhile investment of your time, learning what their experiences are or what their background is or where they're from. At the General Assembly, they're almost always from Indiana. You see that slightly differently in Washington, D.C. But, what do you have in common? Same like you would with anybody. What do they like to do? Where do they hang out? What issues are they interested in? How do kind of bring that back to what you're working on? And it's the same as legislators. You're going to see them in your community. I've run into people at PTO, at events, in the wild, at the grocery store, different places like that, because they are part of your community, particularly if you live in and around Indianapolis with the staff, but if you live anywhere with the legislators. There was a senator that I worked for who I never saw in a suit or anything other than a suit, rather, excuse me. He would go to the grocery store in jeans because it was a completely incognito look for him because no one was used to seeing that. So he got a little bit of privacy that way, but it's, they're people too, right? So getting to know them and getting to know their staff gives you a tremendous amount of access, of influence, and it's a really great foot in the door to be able to make some significant change in the legislative space.
Thanks, Emily. I definitely agree with everything that you said. I know that there are staffers that I've interacted with often enough that they know my name and they remember me. And I think that's helpful because if the legislator brings up being interested in something, the staffer may be the one who remembers you and says, "Oh, you know what? Let's ask that person." And you
Mm-hmm.
want that person to be you. Okay,
Absolutely.
thank you. So, Steve, you're next. You've been known to have some very positive and often helpful relationships with your local legislators in the Fort Wayne area. So, how do you keep contact with them and engage with them throughout the entire year while you're in the district, which is not Indianapolis?
Yeah, well, I definitely agree with the relationship aspect to all of this, and that was something I learned early on. They uh, having that proactive relationship so that when the time comes, when you really need to talk to them, when you really need to get your viewpoint across, having that relationship to fall back on is critical. And for me, I started with one person, back 10, 12, 15 years ago. I was intimidated. I was scared. I felt like they're too important. They're too busy. And I just started with one guy in this case. I had a loose connection with through a friend. Could be a board member, could be another employee at your organization. Find somebody with a connection and just ask them to coffee or breakfast or something. They're all very busy, but they still have to eat. They still have to have lunch and breakfast and so forth. And as Andrew said, they're people just like us, and that was the first thing that I really learned was these guys they're people like us. They don't know as much as us in our area, and they do need our help and support to do their job. And that relationship started and spread as you build that relationship with that first person. You branch out into others, use that person to leverage other relationships, and just stay in touch. And so throughout the year, I ask pretty much all of them at least to a coffee, breakfast, lunch. They definitely get invites to our organizations. And I also show up where they're at quite often. I try to get down to the state house a couple times a year and just go visit them and say hi, even. Um, I pop up at things that they're at locally. There was a mayor's um, luncheon a couple weeks ago. I really didn't have a place there, but I knew not only our mayors were going to be there, but a lot of our state legislatures would be too. So I show up and you may not talk to all of them, but they see your face. And as they get used to seeing your face, then the next time you're in the state house, all those things click for them. So just being in front of them, being in communication with them constantly um, is the way to go for sure.
That's great. Thank you, Steve. I think the constants is really important because they probably do meet quite a few people, even if they're not all constituents. And so having your face around and your name around in nice, friendly settings, I think is a great point to make. Jen, you're up next. You are very well connected with the legislators in your region, and as you've mentioned, you're working on developing some of those relationships even more right now. So please give us one example of a relationship that you've developed and how you're keeping it alive and well.
I'm happy to, and I'm really I want to just give you the backdrop. I was the person who was like, I don't want to talk to a legislator. I don't know how to do it. And I hear people say like, oh, you got to connect. I'm like, but how? What do I say? And I just didn't know really where to begin in a strong way. And so my connection, started with being, the second person when there was another leader who ignited relationships. And then I picked up on those lessons that Emily identified as well and Steve highlighted. So here was our thought that we ignited a year plus ago, and I like it so much. We're continuing to do it. So I do want to share in this 201 with the group. We know our legislators are busy. They're in Indiana, most of them are working full time and they're doing this work at the State House for us. So because of that, the approach of connecting with them when they're not in session is fantastic and very smart to do. But the other point is a lot of people do want to meet with them. But I've got some similar ambitions. If my organization is helping people with low income, I know a couple others that do that too. The Food Bank is one, United Way is one. We also have Center for Workforce Innovations. And so in my role, I got together with those leaders and we said, hey, we can align on some of the things that are happening to all of our agencies, and our legislators should be aware. We also want to encourage our local legislators to have a reputation that the nonprofits, the for purposes in Northwest Indiana, we collaborate and we connect and we, are the experts in some of the bills and some of the decisions they have to make that would impact people in the low income space. So we started coordinating a quarterly lunch. So we did get the help of some like Prosperity, some of our lobbyists, some of us have our own, otherwise we have association lobbyists. We told them we were aware that they had connections with legislators. We created a little invite, and then we had and hosted a lunch once a quarter and invited any of the local legislators. 3 showed up. Every time we've done this, it doesn't matter if we invited 10 or 20, 3 would always show up. And we would always have at least one who said they couldn't come, but did come, one that never responded, and one that committed they could. So it's always a smear. So you got to be ready for it. But when they came, not only were they getting lunch out of it, but we got to capture their attention for 90 minutes in all of our cases. And so 90 minutes, we're just chatting, we're talking, they're getting to know us as people, but they're getting to know what we stand for in our organizations. We had one handout that we all aligned on to kind of either showcase how we co-connect with one another, how someone could walk through services and get support from each place so that they could be a self-sustaining contributor to our community. And so we use that approach, and it's been pretty effective. After that lunch, and we spending that time together, now, as Steve mentioned, when I go in the community and they're at an event, it's very easy to say hi. It's very easy to start a conversation. And when I go to the State House, like not as often as I'd like, but when I get to the State House and make it a point to see them, they only have 5 minutes anyway. And so all you can really get to is some small talk and some rapport building there, but the effort does show. And people do appreciate that we're going out of our way to meet them just as though they came to spend some time with us. So that's a house strategy that we really like, and we're going to keep doing it.
Jen. It sounds like it really works for you, and I could imagine that would work really well for a lot of other people here on the call from different regions. So thank you for sharing that. All right, let's get into our second strategy. And Andrew, are you ready to hop back in?
Sure. Thanks again, Hale. And so the second strategy that we want to talk about is sharing strong stories. So we're not just talking about telling amusing anecdotes to legislators, but thinking about what is the way that you want to connect the best with legislators that lets them know what your area of expertise is and your why for advocacy. So again, I want to offer Prosperity Indiana can help in that process of if you're trying to set up a meeting, if there are, especially during session, we know what bills are moving forward on the issues we care about. We can help take care of a lot of that. What you can do, though, is really think about how to personalize those issues that are important to you. And that's part of what we mean about sharing stories. And it's important, again, we've mentioned this a few times. Legislators are not only not subject experts in all things, but they do hear from a lot of subject experts, and especially on for every issue area, there's going to be a lobbyist. For every business area, they have a trade association, and you better believe that legislators hear about those interests. So we, as Prosperity Indiana and our members, we need to make sure that we're doing every bit as much to make sure that legislators are educated on issues. And so again, while Prosperity can help you with some of the data and some of the background on the policy stuff, you are the best equipped to be able to share your experience. So, don't feel like you have to become the expert on all the technical background. But what you can do is, as you're getting to know legislators, have a two-way discussion. Make sure that you are asking them about their lives and their background, and some of what we heard from Emily and Jen and Steve. Like, you're getting to know them just as they're getting to know you and your work. But also, as you're sharing about your work, you're letting people know about the human impact of these issues you work on. And then eventually, when you're talking about decisions that are in front of them, that they are able to connect their decisions to the impact it has on their constituents and on their districts. And as you see in front of you, people in general are more likely to remember stories about humans than a data point. So it's okay, carry in data point if you have that, but you don't have to feel like you have to be Googling and looking up that type of information. It's better for the human impact to come through. And finally, on this slide, that anecdotal evidence, that's what can help make those big picture, complex issues more relatable. Sometimes you'll see the light bulb go off in the eyes of a legislator because they get what their decisions mean to individual humans, or why something is particularly good or a bad decision. So that's why it's important. Let's go to the next slide and talk about a few ideas to how to approach this. So how to do this. One thing is you want to think ahead and kind of carefully select what are the examples and stories that you want to bring into a conversation. Again, you don't have to feel like you have to overpack things. You don't have to have, reams of data or information or read from a policy sheet, but you do want to be thinking about, say, if you want to be talking about housing stability issues, you want to think ahead about if there are people you've worked with that have certain problems that you want to discuss, or ways that the current policies have broken down. You want to be thinking about how that leads to the point that you're trying to make, so that you're not opening the door to unproductive tangents that sometimes the legislators might be prone to take. You also don't want to overly complicate what you're trying to get at. There are some real issues out there, and it's important to make sure that the human impact is what's coming through, and sometimes making sure that we're not getting into a blame game with some of the discussion points. So keeping those stories digestible and focusing on human impact, necessary points, that's one way to make those stories more relatable. So let's take a look at one example that we have. Again, we talked about this issue of housing stability. That's something that's really important to a lot of Prosperity Indiana members. We know that the state of Indiana has one of the highest eviction and eviction filing rates in the country. We know how that plays out in courts in terms of both the policies on the books and also what the data shows. But sometimes legislators don't know what that means for individuals, and perhaps they haven't seen how it plays out in courts. So an initiative that Prosperity Indiana has worked on is to encourage individuals to participate in court watching. And what you see in front of you here is an example of a story from a court watcher who literally went to a court and watched a morning's worth of eviction cases. And from that time was able to see just how quickly those cases move through. And so you can read here the type of examples. And this could fit into how you share this type of story. So even if, let's say, you're an individual and you're not working with a nonprofit housing group, but you're concerned about evictions, if you are a court watcher, you could have a meeting with your legislator and say, this is something I care about because I've seen the impact in my community. And when I went to court, I could see the type of people that are most likely to come through court. I saw the disproportionate impact of on Black households and families of color because that's who came through the court. I saw how short these eviction proceedings are and how little recourse that tenants have to be able to bring up housing conditions. And I think what's really important here is like the personal impact at the bottom part of this story about seeing that a veteran with PTSD had not had water working for 2 weeks. And so they were forced to go down the street for the basic human need of water. That's the type of thing that sometimes you'll see that light bulb go off when people realize that the policy reason for this, that Indiana doesn't enforce health and safety standards, has that type of personal human impact. So that's just one example of how you can make a big complex issue relatable through personal experience. All right, Hale, back to you.
Thanks, Andrew. And I just want to say, when I was making the slides for this very presentation, I was specifically trying to find this story because we have dozens and dozens of these that got submitted to us. And when I was trying to find it, I was thinking to myself, I want to find that story about the veteran with PTSD who had to use the bathroom at McDonald's because it stuck with me. And I found that very moving. I couldn't have told you, how many cases they observed or things like that, but I was emotionally affected by that last part. And that is what stuck with me. And that's why it's in front of you here today. It's what I remembered and I thought it was worth sharing. So I think that's even right there, just an example of how the personal impact and not always the data is what sticks with us. So just wanted to share that I realized when I was making this slide deck. But now let's go back to our panel. This time around, I'm going to be posing the same question to each of our panelists, but I will, however, repeat it for each one just to keep it fresh. So Emily, again, starting with you, please give us some brief context for one issue that you have advocated on, and then share one story that you might use to succinctly and memorably convey that issue to a legislator. And feel free to, you don't have to go through the whole motion. If you just want to summarize, that's fine.
Sure. So I will say this, what I'm going to tell you now leans heavily on what we're going to talk about later as far as what the right approach is, right? I will also say that this is an entirely different conversation than having folks advocate with you with lived experience. Very different, right? I'm a subject matter policy person. And so if I'm talking to someone, what I'm going to talk to them about is going to be different than if someone is coming saying, I use these programs and this is my experience. That said, always remember that you know more than the people that you're talking to do because you are the subject matter expert. And that goes for both staff and members, state and federal. The context for the story that I'm going to share with you all is actually a federal issue that several years ago, when I was in Washington, D.C., we were talking to Senator Braun and his staff about access to summer meals for kids. So there's a large federal nutrition program that deals with this. And at the time, kids were required to go to the site, eat the meal there, and then leave. They could not take the meals with them. There was no grab and go. This is all pre-COVID. Keep that in mind. And things have changed since then. Talking to his staff, I am from his hometown. I'm from Jasper. I never say I'm from Indianapolis because nobody leads with that in conversations in state work, right? No one's ever from Indianapolis. And so in talking to him and his staff, I said, okay, so let's look at this program. There are 3 summer sites in DuBois County. One of them serving into the entire Southwest School District is in Huntingburg, Indiana. And so if a kid is going to get there from Holland, Indiana, also in the same school district, and doesn't have a ride, it's a 45-minute bike ride one way on 2 state roads. This is not a good idea. This is not how we want to make sure we're delivering food to our kids. So let's think through what other options we have. I can't say that necessarily moved the needle, but it was certainly a very direct, very specific story that I could tell him in a context that made sense to him because he's driven those state roads and so have I, right? So I'm not telling someone's story as what their lived experience would be, but I'm saying this is logistically what has to happen for this program to work the way you think it's working. So that's what I've got.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that, sometimes when we're telling stories in these meetings, we might be reciting a story of a client we've worked with who's just not there. And if they are there, definitely let them tell their story. But if they're not there, you can recite it. And also, the logistical idea is good too, because you can picture that. You can picture a, child or young teenager riding a bike on a road that may not be safe. And I bet that that does stick with people. So thank you. All right. Steve, you're next. I'm going to repeat the question for you. Please give us some brief context on a specific issue you've advocated on and share one story that you would use to succinctly and memorably convey that issue to a legislator.
Well, I decided to take a little different angle on this question, so sorry about that, Hale. But my story is about a local level issue, and it's not about me telling the story because I think one thing I've learned is that sometimes there's not a thing we can say that will change an opinion, and we need others to help out. So, one of my early brutal experiences, maybe the most brutal experience I've ever had in advocacy, was when BrightPoint was trying to do an affordable housing development in Fort Wayne. We needed some zoning change to happen to make the project happen, and so that included getting city council to make that change. And the issue really invited the neighborhoods in, the neighborhoods, of course, learn about those zoning change possibilities. And NIMBY ran rampant, not in my backyard. It was a brutal issue. And at the time, I didn't have a whole lot to fall back on. I was new at this, new at housing development. BrightPoint didn't have much in our inventory. We had done one before, and it was completely different. And so we tried to convince the neighborhoods and thus the city council why this was good, and we failed. And we learned a lot from that experience. And today, and BrightPoint's done five or so more since then. We've learned a lot. We now bring in neighbors from previous projects to show folks, to speak to the fact that this is going to help your neighborhood, not hurt it. You're going to see your property values go up. We now have facilities that people can go through, neighbors if they want to. So sometimes it's bringing in others to provide testimony when you can show people that has tremendous impact. And so that's what I wanted to share on this one is it's not always yourself that may have the story. It may be somebody else.
That's great, Steve. That's very true. And incorporating space for those stories when you can is very helpful. I know sometimes we have to talk to elected officials and we can't bring somebody in, and that is hard. And then we do our best to really convey the story in an impactful way. But when you can bring someone in, that is great to do. Okay. Jen, wrapping up with you, please give us some brief context on some specific issue you've advocated on and share a story that would be memorable and succinct for a legislator.
Sure. This was a good story for me because I got to feel it at our agency. We have funds that can be used for people who aren't on Medicaid yet, but still have daily needs of maybe dressing or taking a bath, those kind of things. And every year, the state determines how much money goes to this funding source or how much money they're going to move it to another funding source. So I actually had an opportunity to give testimony at a Senate session, which was a really big step up for legislative engagement. But it was powerful because I went there with an approach of an example of how the system does work, how Indiana does have the right systems in place. If somebody has $20,000 in their savings, they don't qualify for Medicaid because they have that kind of money behind them, they're probably limited income, or maybe they're retired, right? Limited income, but their body starts to kind of fail a bit. And how, when the system works, they can call an agency like ours and they can get some care while they're maintaining money in their bank account and not Medicaid dependent. But when the state chooses to move 30% of those funds to another bucket, then we run out of funds early every year. And so then we gave the example of what it looks like when the state and the legislators make that decision. And we were able to say how this person now calls us and we say we're out of money, which we do run out every year, and we're out of money. And so now they have to wait before they can get service. And in that 4 months, that person has to spend all of their money and then become Medicaid dependent, or something happens and they fall and now they're in a skilled nursing facility where they're probably not getting out based on their comorbidities. And so when we left that session, we actually had one of our senators come out of that session, meet us in the hallway, and carry on the conversation and saying he has never really understood the funding that way in which we gave the story to explain it. So the story piece was really impactful for them to digest some of the complex things they have to make decisions about. They're not in the industry to know it, so they do need us to make them touch it.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I see how an issue like that is really complicated, and having a story um, probably makes someone take it more seriously, because I think in a long day when there's a lot of votes for these legislators, at some point maybe they just start hitting the button, and it's good to remind them that there are stories behind this. So thank you. All right, so great. We are now going to do our final, mini lesson. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to talk about angles.
Thanks again, Hale. And this is our last big picture lesson, as she mentioned. And so you see here, we titled this as Identifying and Utilizing the Most Effective Angle of Your Issue. I could summarize this by saying it's about know your audience and kind of know your strengths and how to reach your audience. So this is important because even though, using the example of housing stability in this case again, even though you as an individual may know why housing stability and preventing evictions and finding affordable housing is important to you and your neighbors, or perhaps to your organization, legislators may not come from that same background, but they may have other interests that align, even if you're not coming exactly from the same direction. So knowing your audience and knowing what their background and their strengths and their opinions are might help you identify what's the best way to tailor the type of examples and stories, and then how to put your best foot forward in your conversations as you're building those relationships. And on the other hand, sometimes knowing more about your audience it can help teach you that using that wrong angle could set an unhelpful tone, could actually be counterproductive. So let's skip ahead and talk about how we could put this into place. So first of all, know your audience. There's some ways that you can do that. We'll show you one way to get to know some of the background of every state legislator. There's other things you can do too. You can sometimes look up their campaign sites to see what are the issues that they talk about. Look at their social media. What are the things that they are most often posting about? What's their tone? What's kind of the angle that they're coming from? How they approach different issues? Have they talked about your issue? Have they introduced bills on your issue that you can then translate to what you want to talk about? And I also want to mention one more time, you're not alone in this. Prosperity Indiana can help and with some of these conversations and help make sure that you're putting your best foot forward. But there are some of these basic things that you can do so that you're also informed. So coming in, knowing your subject, knowing your audience, you also want to make sure that you have a couple of different ways that you're prepared to talk about this. And I'm speaking in this way, especially towards organizations. We don't expect an individual to necessarily have all this different information or background, but as an organization, you might think about which of your staff members or board members or clients are the folks that are bringing the right perspective and experience to help you have those discussions. All right, let's jump into a quick example. And this one in particular should look familiar to Steve, coming from Northeast Indiana. This is a clip from the caucus webpage, the official webpage for Senator Liz Brown of Fort Wayne, Northeast Indiana area. We work with Senator Brown a lot because she's the chair of this Indiana Senate Committee on the Judiciary, and that deals with a lot of housing issues. So we talk with her fairly frequently. We've had events up in Fort Wayne. We've thought through how do we make sure that we're conveying the community economic development issues we talk about in a way that reaches Senator Brown. So look at this page for a minute and maybe think to yourself, if you wanted to have a conversation about housing stability, for example, or pick your issue, what are the things that you might pick up on? And you might see that she has a couple of different hats. She's not only on judiciary, but she's also on appropriations. Those are money issues over in the Senate. But then especially look at her background and some of the things that she's done in her professional and personal career. And you got a lot of hints here. Senator Brown has a background not only as an attorney, but also she's done a lot of work in the community. She was on the city council. She was on the blight task force. So she has some experience dealing with blighted, vacant, abandoned properties. So that might be a way to start a conversation if you can connect to that issue. You can also see she has a lot of experience in the community with education groups and school groups, with her religious background and church affiliations. Any of those are fair game in terms of finding common ground and thinking about what are the right way to start those conversations. So let me leave it with that. I would love to hear from our panel about how they make those connections and find the right angle.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And just so you know, guys, all state legislators have a page like that, so definitely check out yours. But let's now do our final check-in with our panelists. And it looks like we're probably not going to have much time for Q&A, but we can try and do a little bit of a speed round here as well. So starting with Emily, again, when working on the issue of food security or insecurity, how do you go about deciding what angle to use? What's your process?
I would echo everything Andrew said. Know who you're talking to. I will say every legislator has a bio page. They're not always as full and helpful as Senator Brown's are, unfortunately. But once you've got that, match that up with power mapping. If you just sit down with your staff, your board members, people that are your volunteers, do they go to church with them? Are they involved in the same Cub Scout pack? Are they, what is it that you have some commonality? Because if you're not the right messenger, if you don't have anything in common, or you can bring in someone who has things in common or already knows those legislators, you've already got one foot in the door because the legislator is going to be predisposed to want to listen to someone they already know. And I would say from there, figure out what your connection is, where their interests lie. And so I usually vacillate broadly when I prepare for any issue is what is the efficiency and cost savings angle and what is the social moral justice or this is a better policy angle, and use them interchangeably depending on who I'm talking to. You've got to know that there's going to be more than one side and there's always more than one reason you want the policy you want. So be prepared and be able to pivot quickly depending on who you're in a conversation with to get the right conversation to them.
Perfect. Thanks, Emily. So, Steve, can you speak to the benefit of having multiple partners with you reach out to legislators on the same issue, but utilizing different angles?
Yeah, and first of all, I love being in partnerships with other advocates. They're helpful in so many ways. They can help keep you from walking off the ledge when you get frustrated. They can get you motivated when you need motivated. All sorts of good reasons. One of my favorite groups is the Hoosiers for Responsible Lending Coalition. Fighting for, among many other things, fighting against payday lending, which is one of my biggest enemies around. And that coalition is made up of so many different groups, veterans groups, faith-based groups, community action agencies, Prosperity Indiana, and others, that we are able to attack the issue with different legislators from different groups and really show that this is affecting the elderly. AARP's in the group as well. It's affecting low income people. Catholics don't like it. The Catholic Conference and myself have gotten, speaking of Liz Brown, one year the two of us got our bishop in our diocese up here to talk to our senators. And that year, at least, the bishop got them to vote the right way. So those different angles, those different constituencies are really huge and really useful and can help attack those legislators or elected officials in different ways and different touch points.
Thanks, Steve. We're all for partnership around here for sure. So Jen, last question for you. One of the things you guys work on is housing instability and homelessness. So when you're working on those issues, which angles do you utilize the most and what's your reasoning?
Yes, I have a strong sentiment on the angles, and even those lunches are great places to hear from legislators. What are you most passionate about? What do you care about? Because then you can use that in the future. First and foremost, I do not believe that you can ever change opinion unless you are someone who has a strong influence and a very deep relationship with the person, or they have seen or felt something different. I think you can fact and throw out data all you want, but you're not going to change a vision, a value, a perspective unless people feel it or you're someone of influence. So, in the case of our legislators, since they're not related to me, I like to show them our properties. I do not use words. I want to get them to see how high quality they are. And then I bring in some other data points. We house 65 people with experienced home. No, I'm sorry. We have 65 apartments that we manage of people and families with experienced homelessness. We know that when they're in a program like ours and there's wraparound support and that they're at the properties we're managing, more than 95% of them stay 5 years or longer. We show housing stability, and then we talk about how that reduces medical costs, how that reduces law enforcement call outs, and some of the other positive things in cost savings, because our legislators love hearing about that. That's a big, important initiative they need to be thinking about too. So that would be the piece that we like to do most often.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. This has been really great. I know that we don't really have time for Q&A, but I did want to highlight one thing that popped up in the chat earlier. Towards the beginning, Jen mentioned using a sort of like one-pager sheet when talking to her legislators at those community events that she hosts. And she has offered to send that to me so that I can send it to all of you. So not exactly a question, just wanted to let folks know that somebody brought that up in the chat and we will make sure you get that resource. So special thanks to Jen for that. Okay, so before we go, I am going to launch a really quick satisfaction survey for the folks still here. If you could fill it out, it does help me a lot to know if this was helpful to you. And in the meantime, I'm also going to run through some quick opportunities to get involved and use what you learned today. So the first thing I really want to highlight is to please not miss Advocacy 301, the experience. If you enjoyed this webinar, then you're probably going to enjoy that one as well. Advocacy 301, we're going to be bringing in more folks to do simulations and act out exactly what it's like to have a conversation with your legislators. So this is going to be really interesting and fun, but also practical. We're going to be talking about what it's like to talk to a legislator who is already receptive to your issues, but also what it looks like to interact with one who's a little bit skeptical of the things that you care about. I think all of these things can be really helpful to have perspective on. So we're going to act it out for you and you'll get to see what it looks like. I also want to make sure folks know that Prosperity Indiana leads a couple of statewide advocacy coalitions. So if you're interested in any of these topics that I'm going to fire through quickly, please join these groups. The Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition really works on all things housing. The Indiana Assets and Opportunity Network works on financial empowerment, savings for the future, public benefits and programs, that sort of thing. And then Steve gave a shout out to Hoosiers for Responsible Lending. This group is all about access to credit and fighting back against those predatory lenders that we have here in our state. So if you're interested in any of those groups, please consider joining them. If you need help, let me know. And with that, thank you all for coming. You will get the recording as soon as I can get it out to you, as well as the slides and the resource we mentioned. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers again.